So, I love naval aviation history, and I love naval history as a whole, but what I really love about naval aviation history, especially in the 1920s and 30s, is the sheer number of times you have things change because what you already have in service is just too decent to replace with what's coming available. Now, most famous example of this is the Swordfish, which should possibly have been replaced if you consider it entered service in 1933. In 1936, that's the next cycle. The Royal Navy was doing roughly a 3-year cycle. But what they had available in 1936 versus an improved Swordfish was, frankly, not worth the bother, so you might as well just improve the Swordfish. It's cheaper, more efficient. And that's one reason why the Swordfish is still there in that when World War II begins. The Swordfish is still going, and it carries on going throughout World War II, because it is a very good, very viable design. The Americans have their own equivalent, though, of what I call the fairy albacore problem. In that, the albacore is actually not that bad when you look at it in context of its time. It just never has the good thing it needs. That's the whole Operation C scenario. You know, if it had actually Indian Ocean, I know this has been explored by Naval recently, and it was explored by me and Jamie Seedell on this channel a couple of years back, and it'll be explored again during this year, actually, on this channel. The whole point is, though, if it had had its moment like the Swordfish had Taranto and the Bismarck, then we would remember it very differently than we do. As it is, it sort of slips from history and gets... Just people remember what are some of the bad things about it and the problems it had when it came into service, not how good an aircraft it became. The thing is, the Americans have theirs one step earlier. They have the Devastator, which is in service when World War II begins. And it, of course, is remembered pretty badly, mainly because of Midway. But it was actually a very good aircraft when it enters service in 1937. Compared to contemporaries in 1937, it's a very decent, very standard aircraft. It's not exceptional, but it's not bad either. So one of the interesting things is it basically beats the Swordfish in most of the performance metrics, as you consider it should do, apart from in range. The Swordfish can outrange it. And according to several pilots who flew both, in the ability to be easily flown. One pilot wrote, rather descriptively, the Swordfish could be flown half asleep and half awake. The Devastator did not like you being half asleep or half awake. It required your full attention. It was a very needy aircraft. It liked your focus on it. And that's fine. Again, most aircraft in this period are pretty darn needy. You know, we kind of get lulled into a false sense of security by modern aviation, but aircraft historically were very, very needy. And, well, the Devastator comes along after a period of pretty much stagnation in terms of American torpedo bomber development, mainly because they had such a good torpedo bomber. They had a really good one, which means they skip a generation. Kind of like with the Swordfish, they skip a generation. The American one starts off in the late 1920s, and so they skip the Swordfish generation. And so the Devastator is really comes in at the halfway point of the Swordfish. So that's where these aircraft have to be situated. That's where you have to think about these aircraft in terms of their generations, because everyone's on roughly a 3-year replacement cycle because of the pace of development in naval aviation, because of the pace of development of the aircraft carriers, but also the aircraft technology. Everyone's on roughly the same cycle. So if you skip a phase, skip a generation, you are skipping that generation because, honestly, whilst the improvements have come along, they don't make enough sense to include, and to make a good enough aircraft that you can't keep the existing system. Shameless book plug. Now, this book, thank you everyone who's buying it. There are going to be more books out soon. they're going to be Kindle because they're being self-published, and I am keep trying to talk to publishers about publishing a physical copy of a book and a physical book, and I will hopefully work in that and approaching that. I keep talking to publishers about if they would like to publish my PhD thesis. So far, no one seems to be that interested. At a certain point, that not only has to all be logged and fully open to the public, which it will do, but sort of at that point you lose some of the publishing abilities with it, and so I kind of hoping while it was still technically sealed to use that to my advantage and get a good publishing deal, but so far not working out. We'll see. But that you can win signed paperback. There are 2 signed, and they will be personalised with a note from me to you. There are 2 of them up for, to win in a competition. Link to which is down below. A video explaining it all. But yes, this was the very difficult to replace aircraft for the Americans. The T-4M. The Martin T-4M. And it is... well, as you can see, there's a parachutist jumping off it. There's all sorts of excellence. This was it for American strike power. In terms of aviation strike capability, the T-4M was the big thing. And it was in service 1928 till 1938. That's one of the beauties about it. It's in service till 1938. The Devastator's introduced in 1937. It takes them a year to get all of these out of service. They are good, reliable aircraft. They are what the US Navy builds themselves around. And so I'm looking forward to when I cover the T-4M in key aircraft. It's going to get its own video. But before you can talk about a Devastator, you do need to talk about the fact that this represents such stability. But the trouble is, if you think about it, when you skip not just the 1930 generation, but also the 1933 generation, and really you're talking about the 1936 generation when you are putting in a new aircraft, you've got a bit of a problem going on. Well, you've got a very good aircraft in service, certainly, but you've also got a bit of a problem. Because by the point at which they get to this, they get to that period, to 1937, they have to replace. There's literally no option. They have to replace this aircraft. They are literally starting to fall apart. Aircraft were not built for that kind of longevity at this time. You cannot afford to not replace them. So the US Navy has to go with what's offered, the best of whatever's offered. And there are lots of options offered, mainly because so few people have been involved. There's Brewster put forward an option, Vought put forward an option, Northrop put forward an option, Douglas, Great Lakes, and Grumman, and all put forward options. They all try and contend into this competition. The fact that the Devastator wins, and it is quite such a unremarkable, but not bad aircraft, it's unremarkable though, shows to you the real scenario the Americans have got themselves into. Because they've had this aircraft in service for so long, they've skipped so many generations, and they need to get something newer, because the T-4M, you gotta love it, but it's got a range of 363 miles. That's 316 nautical miles. It's got a cruising speed of 85 knots and a maximum speed of 99 knots. And it pretty much can carry bombs or a torpedo under the fuselage and has a single machine gun in the rear cockpit. This is their frontline strike aircraft until pretty much the end of 1938. Because, let's be honest, the Devastator comes into service in 37, it starts entering service, but A, it takes a while to reach critical mass in numbers, and B, it takes a while to reach critical capability in terms of the fluency of the pilots in terms of flying and using it. And again, not a bad aircraft. If you compare it to the Blackburn Ripon, the Mitsubishi B2M, and others of a similar period, you will find it a very good, very capable aircraft. You know, it fits with them. But it was so good that it gave the funders, and to an extent certain sections of the US Navy, the chance to ignore the developments and the improvements in aircraft until it got too late. There's a really interesting scenario if you look at some of the options which are put forward in the earlier 1930s, 1932 sort of scenario, where they do contemporaneously with a swordfish. And there are some interesting aircraft put forward, but they're not good enough. Or rather, they're not enough of an improvement over this for them to be justified to replace this. The money, the cost of training, the cost of logistics, the cost of all that. For it to be justified, they had to be a far more significant improvement than they were. So, you end up with the Devastator. And the competition is heavy. It is heavy. And there are some really interesting designs put forward in terms of aircraft, but the Devastator always has the advantage, especially when it comes to reliability compared to the others. It was also full of a number of firsts. It has a lot of firsts. It's a good aircraft for its time. You know, it first flies in 1935, entering service in 1937. An aircraft which is the first American carrier-based monoplane. First monoplane to be used from a carrier by the Americans. It's the first all-metal naval aircraft of anyone. It's the first with a fully enclosed cockpit and its time period. These are all great things. It's got power actuated hydraulically folding wings. Those are really useful and are going to save on crew time, and especially service maintenance crew time, because if you consider everyone else with their wings, they have to be moved manually by humans. It also allows you to have heavier, stronger wings, because you're less reliant on humans moving them. These are advantages. And they have a semi-retractable landing gear, which, honestly, I'll be getting more into later, as I'll also be getting more into that canopy. And the reason why it changes from flat in the testbed to a bubble canopy. It's a canopy which covers half the length of the aircraft and is a really roomy space to work, really, for the free crew. It's an absolutely great area to work. If you consider what it was like beforehand, what those three people were working in, if we go and look back at the T4M, you will find out very quickly why the crew were very happy when they got the Douglas TBD, as it was at that time, it's not called Devastator till later, into service. It was a marked improvement on the operating scenario of the T4M. It's a good aircraft. It also has a Norden bomb sight. Now, again, that's something I'm going to be covering in another video because it more is associated with another aircraft in great detail. But it's worth noticing the Devastator has a Norden bomb sight. It's a very useful aircraft. And for the American doctrine of full alpha strike, of full air group attacks, this was a very good torpedo bomber aircraft, an attack aircraft, strike aircraft to have in your flight group. It really was. It's the same trouble as when you sort of go, people sometimes look at it and go, well, hang on, why is the Royal Navy not going with this? And you go, well, the Americans are looking at a long-range strike, at a strike with a massed air group in daytime. The Royal Navy's looking at a long-range strike at night time. And the big advantage for the British, especially with the Swordfish versus, let's say, Devastator, is the British, of course, had their torpedo dropping system, which had a tension wire included to make sure the torpedoes belly flop. So they not only had extra wooden fins added on the end of the torpedo for the aerial torpedo that would break off when it made contact with water, so they wouldn't interfere with its flow, but it also had a tension wire here so that that would help it belly flop. All these things were included in the Fairy Swordfish, and it's another reason it actually does that the Swordfish doesn't get replaced in that cycle, because of the need to include all those things and the difficulty of getting an airframe right to include those things. Fundamentally, though, they're looking for slightly different things. And again, for the Royal Navy, the ultimate thing was a very long-range night strike, and the Swordfish was a very long-range aircraft. As I mentioned at the beginning, its only advantage over the Devastator is its range. Roughly 80 plus miles, depending on which fuel tanks are fitted. Can go more. But still a good aircraft. Both are good aircrafts for their navies. And just as one has become this immortalized memory of a old biplane, ended service in 1933, it was not an old aircraft during World War II, and it was a whole new generation from 1936 onwards, and they were building the aircraft throughout the war, and therefore it's a venerable aircraft that does surprising service in Swordfish's case. Well, it's not so surprising considering its development history and everything. This aircraft has the legacy, the memory of being this terrible aircraft because of what happens to it midway. But the whole point was, this aircraft was designed with the idea, and was developed with the idea, that it was supposed to be part of a whole air group attack. It was supposed to have fighters providing with cover. It was supposed to have dive bombers going at the same time. And as I'll be discussing when we get to Midway, life doesn't work out that way. And sadly enough, the Devastators, which had prior to that not been doing too badly, they'd acquitted themselves okay in other operations. They had not had the devastating losses they would receive at Midway. At Midway, of the 130-ish aircraft which have been built, there are 129 ordered by the Bureau of Ordnance, 2 test examples, one of which hangs around with the company doing further tests, ones which I'm not really sure what happens, and there's all sorts of things. So that's why I go with 130. You have roughly 100 aircraft operational at the beginning of the war. Talk more about that later. You have 41 available with the carriers at Midway. 41. And they are pretty much the torpedo bomber strength of the carriers at Midway. Of those aircraft which are sent off, 6 make it back to the carriers, and only 4 make it back in a way where they're really repairable, as I understand it from the various books I've read. And so this is why, usually, when I'm saying it, you have 4 aircraft, really. You have 2 which are plucky for their crews and get them back. But realistically, you have 4 surviving aircraft from that strike. Pretty much the entire strike. And that's the legacy, which is not earned really by their service, it's by one experience. Just as the Swordfish's legacy of being a venerable aircraft which surprised everyone isn't really the truth. It's not venerable. It's a great aircraft and it does surprise people, but it's literally people's position based on it image being a biplane. It must be an old aircraft. It's not. And Midway, this must be a bad aircraft. It's not. And so that's why I sort of look forward to doing this video and talking about this in the key aircraft, because it's a chance for me to talk about what was a key point in the development of naval aviation for the US Navy. And it really was. So, I kept mentioning this is a perfectly adequate aircraft for 1935. What is a perfectly adequate aircraft from 1937, 35, 35, first flight, 37 entry into service? Well, it's got a crew of 3. Unsurprising, but viable. This is the thing. This whole aircraft screams of this is a viable system. This is something which is going to work in the practical world of the technology we have in the late 1930s. The crew comprised of pilot, torpedo officer / navigator, and radioman gunner. Now, please note the pictured aircraft is the earlier type, the tested type, some testing models, where they have a flat canopy. The Devastator becomes known for its sort of bubble canopy, which just rises up and gives you more headroom and all sorts of fun things. But yeah, this was the flat canopy. There are advantages. There are reasons it was dropped. It has a length of 35 feet exactly. Well, close enough that I'm going to say 35 feet. Wingspan 50 foot, pretty much exactly again. Height 15 foot 1 inch. Always more than 1 inch. And a wing area of 422 square feet. So again, this is all fairly decent stuff. This is what you'd be sort of expecting from a monoplane design in this period when you're looking for these operating characteristics. Has an empty weight of 5,600 pounds. It has a gross weight of 9,289 pounds. In other words, fully loaded. Fully loaded. That's the important thing. Fully loaded, it puts on roughly 3,600 pounds. That's hefty. And useful. Maximum takeoff weight, 10,194 pounds. So, ooh, it can go even heavier. And it's got a Pratt & Whitney R1830-64 Twin Wasp with a 14-cylinder, 2-row air-cooled radial piston engine, 900 horsepower. That's nice. That is a nice system. And a free-bladed variable pitch propeller. All these things are capabilities you would be expecting. And also, all these things add up to a system which makes sense in the late 1930s, but in the view from what happened in World War II, especially later in the war when things went wrong, gets it the title of the not-so-devastating Devastator. But again, put it in the context of the time. Put it against the aircraft which are available when it's coming into service. You can argue it should have been replaced earlier. I would agree. Because, honestly, the Americans are attempting to do a double again. They're attempting... They did a triple with the previous aircraft. That's what they did with the Martin T4M. It was a triple. 3 generations provided by one aircraft. Almost unprecedented. And then they attempt to do a double of this. Because it's pretty much the 1936 aircraft coming in. I know. First flight 1935, into service 1937, but the 1936 rough generation is what I would tend to be matching into, because usually I match them into years, sort of the 3 years. Because if you look at those sort of 3 periods of 36 to 39, and 33 to 36, and 30 to 33, and 27 to 30, and work your way back like that, you will find the aircraft fit. You will find those are where the aircraft start to look similar. They're similar levels of technology in those 3-year cycles. And that's where you find your best benchmarks to really understand whether the aircraft you're looking at is good or bad. The problem is, if that's the case, then this comes into service in 37. It should have probably been replaced by at least something flying in 38. Should have been entering service 39, 40. It's still in service 42. It's 2 of those cycles. And yes, there are other aircraft coming. But the Americans have attempted, they've had something in service of 3 cycles, and then they've attempted to push this for 2 cycles. They keep attempting to try and go almost the economical route, or going, well, actually, you know what, the aircraft available to replace at this period are just not that enough of improvement to go better, to change. But the real advantage, and the thing you miss when you don't upgrade the aircraft, is yes, it might not be that much better in terms of capabilities than the aircraft it will replace, but it's going to keep your stuff keeping pace, your research and development and everything keeping pace, your aircraft and air groups keeping pace with technology. So if you do skip, you're not as far behind. Maximum speed, 179 knots at 8,000 feet. That's 206 miles per hour, or 332 kilometers an hour, at 2,400 meters, for those who want to speak those phrases. Cruising speed, that's always nice to have, 128 miles per hour, or 111 knots. Range, 435 miles, that's 378 nautical miles, with a Mark 13 torpedo. Or 716 miles with 1,000 pounds of bombs. Well, that's an improvement. But again, it's the torpedo which matters, because that's your reliable weapon. Again, for naval aviation in this period, think about it. You know a torpedo will sink a ship, because if you can make a hole in a ship which will let water in, you can sink it. Admittedly, they are being armed with a Mark 13 torpedo, which is possibly, especially at the early point of war, is arguably one of the worst aerial drop torpedoes in that period. It goes on to become much better, but it's kind of like a lot of the American torpedoes at the beginning of World War II, when they start participating. The Bureau of Ordnance, they are wonderful! How dare you suggest anything different? They are wonderful, I tell you! Real world experience, we're getting killed, they're not working. How dare you! They are wonderful! Admiral Nimitz, they are not working. Don't shoot us, we'll go check. Oh, do you know what? They don't actually work. Oh, sorry, Nimitz. Sorry. But that's kind of absurd. It has to get up to the level of the theatre commander basically threatening to commit a version of Harry Curie, only he was planning on trying to make it more painful and ultimately a lot slower to die by, to get people to actually fix things. That's not good. That's not good, and arguably their poor results in Midway, when often, as said, 41 aircraft were launched of the 130 were built. The 41 remaining operational capable aircraft were launched, and 37 are lost, roughly, for no hits, discernible hits and damage. And the thing is, they do launch their torpedoes, and some of those torpedoes possibly hit, but they don't go off. It's a cop-out for the Bureau of Ordnance and a lot of very senior people in American politics, and in even the US Navy, to blame the aircraft. I always love it when organizations do this. They blame the equipment they procured and they chose to use, rather than themselves for procuring it, for continuing to use it, and for not having anything better. Oh yes, it's the aircraft's fault. Did the aircraft hold a gun to your head and make you buy it? Nope. Did the aircraft say, if you replace me with another aircraft, I'm going to bomb you? Nope. Could the aircraft do any of those things? Nope. You can't really blame the aircraft then, can you? And why is America trying to take those jumps? Because they're trying to grow their force as quickly as possible. They're trying to develop their force as quickly as possible. They'd rather put money in longer term development of the next generation aircraft than keep going for the next generation aircraft. One of the interesting things when you sort of start looking at it in the British and the American methodologies of running their air power development in the 20s and 30s, is the British actually have more functioning design teams over companies, like companies which have their own full-blown design teams, not just a couple of designers, but design teams of hundreds of people, sometimes draftsmen, all sorts of capabilities in that included. And the Americans don't. And one of the reasons the Americans don't is they don't replace they try and skip generations. And so what you do is, because if you are not going to have to work that design up to a full design and actually build a version of it, and then work out how you're going to build it in terms of mass production as part of your sales pitch, you don't have all those draftspeople. You don't need them. Now, some firms still have them because they plan on selling their aircraft anyway, and because of the way they run. But a lot of them don't. Whereas in the British scenario, a lot more of the firms in terms of number and as a percentage of firms, had those. Why? Because parts of the British procurement process, which is something good the Air Ministry did, but it is picking up from what had been the Royal Naval Air Service practice rather than the Royal Flying Corps practice when procuring aircraft, was require you to have fully drafted out designs and plans for the production version, as well as the examples built for testing. Which meant you had to do a lot more work on the design of the aircraft. And then if you couple the fact that the British are, in simple terms, the first time the British skip is the Swordfish. That's the first time they skip a generation. If you look at that previously, they have every single generation a new torpedo bomber, a new fighter has entered service. That's the first time they skip. And one of the reasons why they're skipping is they're preparing for war in 1942. And they are literally having those companies work on the future of aircraft, but also the Royal Navy's taking in calculation that they get full control of procurement for their Naval Air Service and full procurement of the Fleet Air Arm in 1939, and so therefore if they skip that generation, they then can order completely their own generation of aircraft in 1939. So basically everyone is taking these calculations and risks. It's not just the Americans. And everyone's guilty of it. Everyone has their own reasoning behind it. But this is what you end up with. This is what you then end up with, and then people going, oh, this is bad or that's bad. And it's not. It's just, it's the generation you've got in service. It's the generation you've got in service. What this diagram and drawing does really well is show the changes in the cowling, in the canopy that are made through testing of the type. And it starts off, as I said, with that flat canopy. It doesn't have necessarily the best viewpoint because of the position of things for the pilot when they're looking around. They're going visibility, and there's a bar right there, and they're going, I can't see anything through the frigating bar. And sort of doing that, and you're not really supposed to fly a plane like this. Believe it or not, it's not considered a good position. It's sort of, this is okay to look around this way because you've still got eye line, if you think about it, out of peripherals, on your controls down here. So you can look up there and still keep some idea of your controls. And the same if you do this. But if you do this, have to do this to watch your 6 a bit and go, where is that enemy aircraft? What's it doing? You've lost complete sight of any controls. It's also very difficult to do in the helmets at the time and the system, the caps they wore at the time. Not as difficult as today's helmets, but still not easy. And yes, you've got other people in the plane that are supposed to be looking around as well, but you always have the policy of the pilot should be able to do it, because what happens if the pilot's the only one still alive? If anything happens to the pilots, you've got even more trouble on your hands if you're one of the other two. But pilot still alive, they need to be able to watch their position and see what's going on. And also it shows nicely where the wheels bulge out to try and cushion a landing if they land on the deck. Now, let's think about this for a second. Okay? That undercarriage is fairly solid and designed to withstand the normal landing on a carrier deck. So if it's in that position and it gets pushed up hard by a belly landing, it can actually do more damage to the aircraft, but it's a nice idea to have. And those are some of the reasons why, I've already mentioned, by the time Midway they have 41 operational aircraft left. That is 41 aircraft aboard those carriers from a procurement which had been roughly 130 and from a pre-war pool of 100 when war began. Attrition had already taken care of them. This is the thing, carrier landings, naval operations, naval aviation, it's a dangerous business. You lose aircraft. You lose aircraft to needs of spare parts, you lose aircraft to wing stress, you lose aircraft to landings. So, this is part of the procurement metric. This is also part of the cycle of procurement. You have to factor in that you might not, by the time these aircraft go into operation, you might not have all the aircraft you ordered. So if you only order enough, just enough, you definitely won't have enough when it comes to the time for crunch. And I would love to say this is a lesson which hasn't repeated itself time and time again in military procurement, but it really has. 1940 is when the US Navy starts work on the Avenger. And by starting work, I mean very, very beginnings of it, because again, they thought they had time. I'm not sure what it is in the 1930s and 40s, but everyone thinks they have control over when the war's going to happen. They all think they have a schedule and it's all going to give them time. The only ones who seem to actually be on anything like an accurate schedule of when war's going to happen is the Japanese. And none of their procurement plans actually make sense anyway, even on that scenario, because they are certainly not procuring with the idea of being viable and capable of doing so before war begins. But they're the closest to it. The Brits are organising their escort construction in 1939 and putting the orders in place before war begins, because they think they have till at least 1942, which is plenty of time to get all those Flower-class corvettes and Hunt-class escort destroyers into service, crewed up, or outfitted to the reserves, and positioned where they need them to be by 1942. And the Americans have got the Devastator, as they call it by the end of 1941. Prior to that, it had been called the TBD. That's it. And they know it needs to be replaced. They know it needs to be replaced. They know it's not as good as it could be in comparison to other aircraft. And what are they doing? Well, they're slowly walking towards getting an improvement. They are slowly doing some things about the Granum Avenger. They are slowly processing through it. They're down to 100 aircraft, pretty much. Especially once you start going through the fact some aircraft have been turned into target tug duty. Some units, whole squadrons, have been shifted to training duties. It's absurd. It really is absurd. Once you start looking up and thinking, well, when does the Avenger come into service? This is what replaces it. It comes into service in 1942. Okay. So, what you're saying, it's an aircraft which they're arguing, oh, in 1940 you realise this aircraft's outclassed. Let's be honest. You realise beforehand. You are jumping on, by stating 1940, you have
You're jumping into a development, a next development cycle. You're trying to claim it's the earlier one, but you're really in the 1941 plus development cycle. We'll leave that to one side. You're heading towards that. You're going to end a service in 1942. All right. So you've skipped some of the development periods. Good for you. But you would expect them, if they thought war was going to be soon, or was a high priority, you would expect this aircraft to be a high priority for replacement. Because, as I've said repeatedly, and I'm going to say it again and again in this video, because it is a point you have to think about when considering any torpedo bomber, they weren't sure still if dive bombing worked. If dive bombing would deliver enough hits against a moving vessel, would cause enough damage, would cause enough issues to actually sink a vessel. There were some ideas it might, but there are also conflicting lessons coming out of the war in Europe about what was happening in 1939, 1940, because we can all think of ships which were sunk by dive bombers in a period, but we can also think of ships which were hit by dive bombers and survived. There are actually quite a lot of those. And this is a real problem. But the thing was, because let's look at the evidence that's coming out from an actual war that was going on at this time, from 1939 through 1940 and 1941, that torpedo bombers, if the torpedoes get in, they sink their targets. They damage their targets. So torpedo bombers, which also were proved in World War One, are the actual known quantity. Dive bombers are the things you're investing in because they offer an opportunity for future growth and future capability. But this is the known quantity. So you invest in this because this is supposed to be your primary hitting capability. It's going to really give the carrier guaranteed teeth. And so we come to the Devastator's career. And their operational history starts off well. Honestly, their peacetime service for the US Navy in between 1937 and 1941 is very good. They are critical for many air groups. They do provide a lot of value in operations. They provide a lot of value in exercises. They are useful aircraft. They're helping them to grow their capability. And when the Pacific War does start, well, they are useful in operating from Enterprise in Yorktown, in attacking targets in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, Wake and Marcus Islands, aircraft from Yorktown, Lexington, struck Japanese shipping off New Guinea in March 1942. And in the Battle of Coral Sea, it's Devastators that sink, well, often classified as help sink, but I would argue sink, the Shoho. They failed to hit the Shokaku the next day, but let's be honest, this is where the Mark 13 torpedo is really starting to show it has problems. It's starting to show it has problems, but the trouble is it takes a long time to get the Bureau of Ordnance on side to actually realise there are problems and to actually fix those problems. There's a very good quote about it, which you can find in the US Navy Bureau of Ordnance World War II. I would describe mostly as edited and compiled by Roland Bufford and William B. Boyd. Published, I think, 1953. That's the digital version I have. I am trying to track down my own hard copy, but I have a digital PDF version, which I'm reading from. It's always fun to have. Page 120, according again to my PDF version, okay? Although the Mark 13 was available when the Pearl Harbor attack came, it was not used effectively or extensively until almost 3 years later. The relatively low speeds and altitude required for successful release were not destined to win popularity for the weapon. The operations at Midway emphasized the dangers involved, and airmen complained bitterly of the handicaps of obsolete tactical training, obsolete torpedo planes, and obsolete equipment. The last item in their indictment was a continual concern to the Bureau of Ordnance. Although the basic similarity between the Mark 13 Mod 1 and the Mark 10 showed that the charge was overdrawn, the torpedo was not adequate for modern warfare until a series of alterations were effected. Like the Mark 14, the aircraft type went through a cycle of troubles. During the early months of use, left deflection was a persistent problem, and demanded change of the rudder flows. No sooner was that corrected than the chronic depth failures were detected. The propellers were shown to be too weak to stand the shock of high-speed launching, and the exploder mechanism required modification to keep it from arming in the air. Even when the apparent defects were eliminated by modification, the torpedoes remained unpopular with the men who had to use them. Underlying the problem faced by the Bureau was the fact that many failures, which were attributed to poor design of torpedo components, were really due to failure to control aerodynamically the angle of torpedo entry into the water. Until that was accomplished, delicate controls could not be made rugged enough to withstand the strain of water entry, and other defects could be neither corrected nor detected. Changes in the tail surfaces, rudders, and head shapes failed to cope with the basic problem. More drastic expedients were attempted. One method by which air stability was sought was to bolt plywood extensions to horizontal vanes of the torpedoes. While that improved air stabilization in some cases, different extensions had to be used for different planes, and each had its own speed and altitude limitations. Other vagaries for further reduced their effectiveness. If the extensions were not dislodged soon enough, they ruined the water on a torpedo. If they were dropped too soon, air stabilization was lost before water entry. In the spring of 1942, the best available solution seemed to be biplane extension stabilizers bolted to the torpedo vanes, but that was considered an expedient and not a solution to the continuing problem. Despite the complications that were attending the other phase of torpedo development, the Bureau of Ordnance considered that the aircraft torpedo problem was so important that it was assigned the highest priority at Newport Station. The improvements and the modifications of 1942 and 43 still left the weapon unpopular. However, production problems were as great as those stemming from incomplete development. In mid-1943, an analysis of 105 torpedoes dropped at speeds in excess of 150 knots showed clearly why aviators distrusted the Mark 13. 36% ran cold, 20% sank, 20% had poor deflection performance, 18% gave unsatisfactory depth performance, 2% ran on the surface, and only 31% gave a satisfactory run. This is under test conditions when you're not dodging enemy fire or having to deal with any other issues. The total in excess in excess of 100% proved that many torpedoes were subject to more than one of the defects, just as the bulk of problems was still due to the effects of poor air stabilization on water behavior. Better performance at reduced aircraft speeds was a small comfort, since aviators could not be held down by paper restrictions that imposed serious and dangerous handicaps in combat. And even when they accepted limitations, the water entry behavior of the torpedo produced frequent hooking and broaching. Time promised to complicate the problem still further. Unsatisfactory for existing planes, the torpedo would certainly fail to utilize the potentialities of aircraft then under development. Confronted with such a problem, the Bureau felt that it had two alternatives. It could accept the Mark 13 as an interim weapon with recognized tactical limitations and initiate and design a new torpedo, or it could concentrate on eliminating the known defects of the existing weapon. To attempt both might spread effort too thin to assure success in either venture. The first alternative involved predictable delay, since the Bureau estimated that 2 years would be required to move a weapon from conception to production. On the other hand, 12 known defects seemed to preclude immediate success in converting Mark 13 into an effective aircraft torpedo. Neither alternative was considered alone, so the Bureau decided to increase its resources and follow both at once. The National Defense Research Committee was appealed to for aid, and in late 1942 it accepted a double-barreled order from the Bureau. The committee was given a blank check to produce a new aircraft torpedo, the Mark 25, for tactical use at 350 knots launching speed, and they agreed to aid the Bureau in making immediate improvements to the Mark 13. Now, really, those improvements, they are something we can talk about in further aircraft, because they all come in far too late for the Devastator. And that's a big problem. Again, a torpedo bomber has a symbiotic relationship with its torpedo. One of the reasons for the Swordfish being the way the Swordfish is, and for the Albacore being the Albacore the way the Albacore is, and for some of the British ideas that led to issues with the Barracuda, are the way the British stabilise and operate their aerial torpedoes. to try and eliminate those same issues, to eliminate those same issues of how the torpedoes enter the water, how they drop those torpedoes and they enter. As I remember I've said at the beginning, the British torpedoes, they have a tension wire as well as wooden fins to make them belly flop. That's a very ingenious idea. It's one of the reasons why the British aircraft are built the way they are. But that's also something which fundamentally changes a lot of structures on your aircraft to support that tension wire. A lot of the aircraft has to be built around that. So you can't just adopt that system. You have to, in many ways, design your aircraft to facilitate that system. And this is the problem for the Americans. Another problem which comes back to skipping that development cycle. They've also been skipping the development cycle of their torpedoes. Or rather, the redevelopment cycle of, as every generation of aircraft come in, you have to check that the torpedoes work with that new generation of aircraft. You can't rely on old stats and old checks. You can't go, well, we tested this in 1930. Oh yeah, we tested this in 1937. Oh, we did some carrier trials. Yeah, the aircraft can drop the torpedo. We're sure it's okay. Because with every generation, you have to recertify everything properly. If you have the funding to, of course. And that's another issue. For the Bureau of Ordnance, for the whole Navy, for every service, in every nation, it's getting the funding to do things which, for many people, is that not just not accepting a sufficient risk margin? Shouldn't you, you would accept a greater risk margin in terms of the capabilities of these weapons in wartime, why aren't you in peacetime? It saves money. It does. But also doing that testing can reveal these problems before wartime. And the more you've eliminated problems in weapons before wartime comes about, the better those weapons perform in wartime. But still, she was not a bad aircraft. Midway, as I've been alluding to at several points, is where the big problems come up. At Midway, there are a total of 41 Devastators. They are spread across Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown. Spruance ordered a strike on the enemy carriers immediately after they were discovered. He has no other option. I know there are going to be some people who go, well, no, he should have waited, etc. No. You have a countdown. Remember, the Americans and the Japanese both practice the Alpha Strike philosophy. Whoever hits first wins. That's the idea. You hit them before they hit you. Or worst case scenario, you hope your strikes cross in midair without seeing each other, and therefore you neutralize each other's carriers completely. That is the idea between the Alpha Strike orientation. And the fact that their carriers are orientated around that is, again, their reaction to the Washington and London naval treaties and limitations they've imposed on carrier designs. Even on the Japanese, who've not always taken much notice of the treaty limits, they've still had to build their carriers in such a way they at least pay lip service to it, and that affects their design and shaping and their operational capabilities. The Devastators from Hornet and Enterprise lost contact with their escort. They started their attacks without any fighter protection. And at this point, some authors describe the Devastator as a death trap for its crews. Well, if you're going to say that about this aircraft, then what do you say about the Swordfish? And the trouble is, some of those same authors, because I've read those books, will, in the same way they write off the Devastator as a death trap for its crews, will talk about the Swordfish being a plucky aircraft that came through for its crews. And you go, well, you can't say that because it's slow, then. That doesn't count. That can't be used because the Swordfish is slower. And I know I keep bringing up the Swordfish as a counterpoint, but really, that is one of the closer counterpoints to this aircraft. This aircraft comes into service at a time that Swordfish is continued in service. This aircraft is continued service at the point they bring in the Albacore, in terms of British, which is the British really equivalent of Devastator in terms of, this is supposed to be filling in until we get what we really want to replace the long-term great we've had in service. And to be honest, the Swordfish outserves this, mainly because of its range. Honestly, it's the range which is the saving grace for the Swordfish. It allows it to be... It's the amount of stores it can carry in its range is just what keeps it in service. They describe it as its speed on glide bombing approach was a mere 200 miles per hour. That's not bad. Especially not when you're an aircraft which was designed to be operating with fighter escort. They didn't have fighter escort. The aircraft knew they didn't have fighter escort. They knew they'd lost their fighter escort. And they still went in. Because they knew the Alpha Strike idea. They had been trained, they had been bred as the US Naval Aviation on the idea that who hits first and hits hardest wins. That's the point of an Alpha Strike. You smash the enemy. That's it. And so, you might not have the escort you're designed to be operating in, but there's your target. You're going to do your level best to take it out. But the problem for a torpedo bomber, as the Swordfish would tell you, etc., is it has to fly in a pretty much straight and level pattern for at least a while it's dropping the torpedo to get the best drop on the torpedo. And that's the British with all their systems, their reliable torpedo and their reliable torpedo delivery system, which does, by the way, limit their speed and all sorts of things when they're putting in water to make sure it gets that belly flop so it runs in. These have the Mark 13, and they are doing it in daylight. The British train to use their Swordfish, etc., at night time. How do the British get around the problem of the torpedo bomber having to do that flight characteristic? Attack at night, which works pre-radar. The Americans' method of getting around it was to have a fighter escort. If you don't have a fighter escort, the predictable happens. It's not that the aircraft is bad. It's not even that the concept is bad. It's just war happens and things didn't go to plan. Yes, the aircraft should have been replaced earlier. Yes, it was not as good as the Americans could have had available at that time. But that's not the aircraft's fault. It's not the terrible Devastator. It's the terrible Bureau of Aircraft and all the sort of the US bureaucracy that's procuring aircraft. Of those aircraft getting back, 4 get to Enterprise, none get to Hornet, and 2 get to Yorktown. And as I said, I think 2 of them are pretty much unserviceable at the moment, even after they land. Just, they land and the crews get off. It's a miracle, mainly, they get back. I'm trying to remember which of those ships it was on, but it's somewhere in my notes. The Navy immediately puts the blame for a lot of the issues and losses on the aircraft. They don't point out the fact that the the TBD's Devastator's attack drew off the Zeros and absorbed the Zeros so much that when the dive bombers arrived with the fighter escort, they were able to actually focus in, and to extent some of the quite a lot of the Japanese fighters were out of the way because they've been off dealing with these. They also didn't mention that of the 6 Avengers at the Battle of Medway, 5 were lost, and none of them scored any hits during the Battle of Medway, because that would have admitted that the Mark 13 torpedo was next to useless, and therefore someone actually even sending these crews in with such a weapon to attack target could possibly have been considered culpable for some kind of negligence, or maybe even manslaughter. Those are tough words to throw around, but let's be honest, if you've got a torpedo that you already realise at this point is not really working the way it's supposed to be, and you send people into this scenario with an aircraft, and they're going to have to launch a certain form of attack to deliver that weapon, a version of attack which is very, very dangerous because of the way it requires you to fly to try and accurately launch a torpedo, and it turns out that weapon doesn't work, you could make an argument that you were throwing away lives and valuable resources. But that is all for the summary. That is all for the summary. So, the Devastator. Not devastating. Not devastating. But not a bad aircraft either. Honestly, one of the things I find most frustrating about the 1920s and 30s is the amount of people who view aircraft through the prism of what they become in 1945. What they are at the end of World War II, not what they are at the beginning of World War II. They look at them and think they should be the finished article at this point. And even World War II, at the end of World War II, they're not the finished article. They're not. They're still developing. You wouldn't use the aircraft of 1945 today. You wouldn't. They wouldn't work in the modern battlefield. And so many things changed. So many things had come into service. Sorry, my computer decides to just keep notifying me. No idea why. I thought I turned it off. So many things come into service that it's a changing smorgasbord. It's a constant movement. In the 1920s and 30s, you have this constant evolution of aircraft and carriers, but it's over a 3-year period. In World War II, all these experimental technologies, which you hadn't had the money to turn into a real thing, but which you've been playing around with, start entering service. People start giving the money to turn it in from this very nice thing which you've got working but haven't developed into a deployable, a usable asset, to turn it into a deployable, usable asset. Which means if you're chucking that at all your research, things can change in a 3-monthly period, let alone a 3-yearly period. This is why the real burst of technology you see in terms of new technology coming into service is roughly 1939 to 1943. And from about 1943 onwards, mostly what you're getting are improved variants and almost evolutionary development of that technology as war experience filters in, as production experience filters in, as you do more testing, as you get more understanding of how it works. And the new technologies are mostly already in. But the thing is, you have such a surge of technologies in that first period, in those first years of war. It changes everything. It changes the world. So with that in mind, let's consider this. Let's consider the options. What could be a possible question I could ask about the Devastator? Well, what I'd like you to do, because I've done a lot of this discussion in this topic, is I'd like you to think about the reputations we all know about aircraft. The reputations that exist. The venerable, the terrible, the supreme, the awful. And think whether they are really justifiable in terms of their context at the time. Are they something we see in if we're looking backwards? Are they something we see because of the specific spin and discussions put on, because of what happened in the battle that served the interests of others? Are they because of one event, because of the way one thing turned out, or are they because of a balance point of their career? Another good example I would give is the Albacore. There is a whole song in the Fleet Air Arms songbook about bring back my Peggy to me, all about the Swordfish, because The albacore's Taurus ain't sound. And it's very true at the beginning, but by the time you get to Operation C, into the Indian Ocean operations, the Taurus is fine. Taurus is reliable. You're using the Taurus. But think about the reputation of the albacore. It's a viable, useful aircraft which is used for quite a large chunk of World War II as a frontline strike aircraft and does fairly well in several operations. But it doesn't get the big hit, the big success like the Swordfish did. So it never gets the chance to have the reputation the Swordfish did. And then it's replaced because there are better aircraft available. They say history is written by the victors. But I would argue the narrative is often written by those who choose to write it first. And a narrative, once written, is very hard to alter. First impressions can forge a narrative which can fly completely in the face of all other information, but it is the narrative forevermore. So I'd like you to think about naval aircraft, about land-based aircraft. I'd like you to think about them all. I'd like you to think and comment below about aircraft, what their reputation is, and how that fits with the reality of them. Whether they are that bad, or whether they are aircraft of their time. Because again, it's very easy to say Devastator was a bad aircraft. It wasn't. It was an aircraft of its period, and in its largest, most famous operation, where it lost the most examples in one go, it was used in a way it wasn't supposed to be, on a mission which you could argue it shouldn't have been sent on in that form. Might have been better to arm them with bombs rather than torpedoes. Let's be honest, whilst the torpedo is the best method of sinking a ship, for that it has to hit the ship. And if you'd armed them with 1,000-pound bombs, they'd have been faster, they'd have been more manoeuvrable, and they could have flown and attacked in a completely different way. But that would also require rearming them when they were already armed with torpedoes to go in as part of a full strike package, a full alpha strike. So next week, what have we got coming up? We have the British World War II Carrier Naval Aviation Doctrine, pre-war to war. Luckily, there is a little time before we get to the American discussion of doctrine. That's in April. But every time there's a month of a 5th Tuesday, those are the topics to be discussed. The doctrines on the Carrier Naval Aviation doctrines and what they are. Hope you enjoy. Hope you find it useful. Thank you for watching. If you like the video, please like. If you want others to see the video, please share. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe. All the buttons I think are down there. And if you want to support the channel, well, you can become a member of the channel, which gives you very cool emojis for chatting when there are lives, including a Beef Wellington, but also fluffy research assistants and various other ships. And then we have Patreon, and we have Ko-fi, and various other ways of also supporting the channel should you wish to. And thank you everyone who does do that, because you make the channel possible. Take care. Hope you enjoyed the video, and have a nice, well, evening my time when this comes out. Could be morning your time if you're elsewhere in the world. Could be afternoon. Could be midday. Could be lunchtime. Whatever you're doing, I hope you're enjoying yourself. Take care. Have fun. And always remember to keep asking questions in history, because there's always more to learn.